Okay, welcome back to another episode of The Right Call. I'm here with my partner in crime, Cole Boston Altman. Cole, how are you today?
I'm pretty good. How are you?
And I'm your co-host, Mark Altman, and I'm in a really bad mood today. We're going to talk about the Celtics because the Celtics need to be talked about. And I'm very, very disgruntled. And it doesn't help, by the way. Let me just get this out of my system. It doesn't help that Brian Scalabrine is the worst announcer in the country who states the obvious and embellishes every detail throughout the game constantly. And he just makes me want to listen to Cedric Maxwell on the radio, and that's the ultimate put down, because anybody who would motivate me to listen to Cedric Maxwell knows you're an awful announcer. All right, I got that out of my system. So, Cole, I want to take this from a different approach, okay? So people are always talking about what's wrong with the Celtics. Is it Danny Ainge? Is it Brad Stevens? Is it the players? And what you may not realize yesterday is Danny Ainge came out yesterday and made this big statement that he takes the blame for what he called, quote unquote, a not very good team. So, but let's be real. That was just a ploy by Danny Ainge to take the pressure off Brad Stevens because of how much grief Brad Stevens is getting lately. But Cole, where I want to start with is a word called attribution. And attribution is about who gets credit, who gets blame. Now, we just saw this with the Super Bowl, right? So Tom Brady didn't win the Super Bowl despite popular demand. The Tampa Bay Buccaneers actually were the team that won the Super Bowl. But what does everybody do after the Super Bowl, Cole? Who gets all the credit? Is it Tom Brady? Tampa Bay never makes the Super Bowl. So, Cole, let's start right there. What percent of the credit does Tom Brady get for having the Tampa Bay Buccaneers win the Super Bowl?
I think obviously he should get most of the credit. I think most of the games during the playoffs, he was pretty much flawless, especially the Super Bowl. He played an amazing game. But in the NFC Championship, he looked despicable. He threw 3 picks. And even though he threw still 3 touchdowns and he threw it for a ton of yards, it still wasn't a great game. And he turned the ball over. I think more of the credit should go to Tampa's defense than offense.
Okay, so the recurring theme as we go into the show today about the Celtics is, and I often talk about this when I teach communication, it takes 2 to tango, right? If there's an argument or a disagreement, it's usually both sides had a role in it, not one person. With the Super Bowl, listen, Tampa Bay doesn't win that Super Bowl if Tampa Bay's defense doesn't dominate the way no team has dominated the Kansas City Chiefs offense like that defense did in the Super Bowl. So how did the Tampa Bay win the Super Bowl? They had a great defense that kept getting better throughout the playoffs. They had a quarterback who provided leadership that they hadn't had previously with Jameis Winston. And they got some key weapons. They have some of the best offensive weapons in football, right? So those are the reasons why Tampa won the Super Bowl. So what we're going to talk about today is something called blame pie. And a former talk show host in this Boston area, Eddie Andelman, made that famous years ago. He talked about when you're frustrated with people and you divvy up the blame into like a pie chart, like what percent. So the Celtics struggles do not solely rely on Danny Ainge. They do not solely rely on Brad Stevens, and they do not solely rely on the players. And today we're going to break down what that blame pie looks like with the Celtics. And before we get in this, Cole, I just want to get one other elephant in the room out of the way about the Celtics. Because I don't want to hear from any Celtic apologists after the show, okay? So I keep hearing from people, well, Mark, what do you want from them? They've made the Eastern Conference Finals 3 of the last 4 years. I mean, you're hard on Brad Stevens and you're hard on Danny Ainge, but Eastern Conference Finals 3 of the last 4 years. Well, let's look at that. So the first 2 years they made it, they lost to Cleveland. Okay, we'll give them a pass on that with LeBron in Cleveland. I mean, I think they achieved, those were significant accomplishments. Okay, then year 3, they don't make the Eastern Conference Finals, and they lose in 5 to Milwaukee and embarrass themselves in that series on how much they got outplayed by Milwaukee. A Milwaukee team, by the way, who has proven time and time again they are chokers in the playoffs. Their coaching, to me, is coming into question. A Milwaukee team who has just recently lost 5 in a row, by the way. Okay, all without Drew Holiday, mind you, but lost 5 in a row. So they lose in 5 to Milwaukee, Cole. And that brings us to last year. So they lose in the Eastern Conference Finals. So, Cole, let me ask you this. Going into the playoffs last year, before we saw anything unfold, what was your expectation? Knowing the parity in the Eastern Conference, there was no LeBron James Cleveland Cavaliers. What was your expectation going into the playoffs last year?
I expected the Celtics to go to the championship. After seeing them beat Toronto in 7, I thought they played well in that series, aside from the Game 3 where they let OG Anunoby have the buzzer beater. I thought they swept Philly in the first round. And I thought Miami, even though they had beat Milwaukee in 5, I still thought they weren't a good enough team to beat the Celtics, the new renewed Jason Tatum, all-star Jaylen Brown team. And I thought they were going to go to the championship, but players like Duncan Robinson and Tyler Hero and Jimmy Butler and Bam Adebayo really stepped up for the Heat, and Celtics just couldn't get past them.
Okay, so the bottom line is most people, I thought, expected the Celtics to get to the finals, especially based on how the last 3 years had gone previously. And the fact of the matter is they sweep a 76ers team that didn't have Ben Simmons for the majority of that series. Okay, still give them credit. It was a nice win, but the Sixers were in disarray. Brett Brown was a terrible coach, so they beat the Sixers. Then they go up 2-0 on the Raptors, and then they have a loss of focus and motivation and energy. The Raptors tied. It ends up going to 7. They pulled it out. A gritty series win by the Celtics, even though they made it much tougher on themselves than I think they needed to, partly because of a letdown of focus and energy during that series. And then we get to Miami, the surprise team in the playoffs last year. And so Miami beats them, and Miami beats them with hustle and effort, and they beat them with just grit and determination because Miami's roster was not better than the Celtics roster. But Miami played harder and was more consistent, and Jimmy Butler was phenomenal in that series. So this brings me to the point. When I look at people want to say they've made it to the finals 3 of the last 4 years, what was your expectations before you want to crown them and give them so much credit? Didn't you expect with this roster? I mean, heck, going into last season, they had the big 4, even though Hayward's hurt most of the time. So with the amount of talent, I mean, I know they didn't have much of a bench, but with the amount of talent they had, I expected them to go as far as they did. I don't think Brad Stevens elevated their performance last year. I think he got them where they should have gone. So let's start with this. Let's start with Danny Ainge, Cole. Let's start with the first slice of the blame pie, and let's start with Danny Ainge. In your mind, Cole, where has Danny Ainge fallen short as general manager of the Celtics based on where this roster is currently standing?
I think the trade exception I think obviously it's not gone yet, but I think that he needs to do something with it. And I think that time's ticking. And before this roster gets too bad and in too much disarray and we have a losing record and we are fighting for a playoff spot, he needs to sign a big player with that trade exception. Also, I don't think he's been great at signing free agents. Yes, he signed Kemba, but Kemba wasn't a great signing. Gordon Hayward wasn't a great signing. So I think Danny Ainge has made some bad signings over the years, but his draft picks have been good, but not his signings.
Okay, well, so let's tackle the different pieces you said. First of all, with the trade exception, everybody needs to realize that it's not just the use of the trade exception, it's the use of it compared to Miles Turner. Because that's the guy they could have had and should have had, who is now one of the best defensive centers in the NBA. But because Danny Ainge muffed and bluffed that whole thing with Indiana and Hayward going to Indiana, he came up with nothing. So now we're all waiting for this magic to occur for the trade exception. So for the fans out there waiting for the trade exception, just make sure you compare whoever they do end up getting against Miles Turner, because that's who it should have been initially. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is, as far as the Hayward and Kemba signings, I don't begrudge Ainge for the Hayward signing. I mean, it ended up being a mess because of all the injuries, but I don't think that was the wrong signing necessarily. I just think it didn't work out. And the Kemba Walker thing, boy, I have to tell you, I was a big fan of that signing when it first happened. And I just love Kemba. He's such a great leader. He's such a great guy. But he just doesn't look like the same guy. And I don't know if it's knee injuries, all the knee injuries or the rust or whatever. I also think it's underplayed on Kemba is not the go-to guy when Tatum and Brown are on the floor. And in the same way Hayward struggled to find his niche in the offense. I think Kemba is struggling to find his niche in the offense. But Cole, the thing I want to talk about with the trades is forget the free agent signings. The last 2 years, Danny Ainge has been silent at the trade deadline. They have had championship caliber teams, and he has done nothing to improve those teams. They have one of the worst benches in the NBA relating to offensive output. And, the Kyrie thing a few years ago, he should have traded Kyrie when he knew Kyrie wasn't going to come back. And the lack of movement is just upsetting, not to mention all the draft picks he had to play with to create change with the roster. So I have to tell you, I think the lack of trade deadline movement to improve the bench and the overall offensive options on this team is horrendous.
I agree, and I think even going back to the Al Horford signing, I think that was a good signing. At the beginning, we always see these stars being signed to the Celtics, and we're like, oh, this is a great signing. But then when we look deeper into the signing, we're like, wait, was that such a great play for the Celtics? Does that person fit in with our team? And also, if I may go off the road a little bit, I think there's one player the Celtics are really missing that would turn their whole team around.
Okay.
Kelly Olynyk.
Well, no, but I'm actually, I know you're being sarcastic, but I'm glad you brought him up because frankly, Cole, that's part of, that piece is part of the problem with the Celtics and Ainge and Stevens. I hold them accountable because they have such a big infatuation with tall white guys that can shoot from the outside. This is the whole thing. I mean, you look at it, all started with Kelly Olynyk, right? We're going to get, because apparently the trend in the NBA is to get people that can shoot from the outside and hit threes and big men. Okay, but do those big men who can shoot from the outside, can they actually have another skill in their game beyond just shooting from the outside? I mean, Cole, look at the Celtics centers. We've got Daniel Tice, who's now a three-point shooter, apparently. And what is Daniel Tice's strength? He's shooting from the outside, he runs the pick and roll well, and he's a mediocre defender. Then you've got Tristan Thompson, who is a tremendous offensive rebound, very limited offensive skills, and looks like he's running with a load in his pants all the time. And then you've got Robert Williams, who apparently, I don't know what he does or doesn't do, but Brad Stevens, I think, flips a coin half the time to determine what, if Robert Williams is going to play at all, and if so, how often he's going to play when he plays. And Robert Williams, times, you watch him, and Cole, tell me your thoughts on this. You watch Robert Williams, and there are times when you watch him, you go, wow, look at this guy. He's flying around the court, ton of energy, making steals, blocking shots, dunking alley-oops. And then there are times you don't even notice him out of the floor.
Totally agree. And I think it's him being aware. Like, I think sometimes he comes with the energy where he wants to play and he's ready to fight, but also I think sometimes he comes with the energy where he's just out there as a big man, grabbing a few rebounds and going back to the bench. I think it's the mindset that he comes out with that really determines his skill during his playtime during the game.
Well, and what's happened is if you put, and I'm not even getting to tackle fall, but if you put Tice, Robert Williams, and Tristan Thompson together, their skill sets, you actually have a quality big man together. The problem is 2 of your 3 big men in Tice and Robert Williams are not good rebounders, especially for their size. So my biggest thing with Danny Ainge is the kind of roster he has put together is so one-dimensional. And not only is it one-dimensional, you don't have guys on that bench who you can say, if I put this guy in the game, I know what I'm getting. J.J. Redick, who's one of my favorite bench players in the last decade, you know what you're getting when J.J. Redick comes in the game. He's an instant scorer. He's a good outside shooter. Grant Williams comes in the game. I have no idea what he's going to do. Another below-average rebounder, even though he's an undersized big, another below-average rebound. Is Grant Williams going to guard a wing player? Is he going to play defense? Is he going to rebound? Like, what the heck is he going to do? And if he does do it well, how consistent? Semi Ojeleye. We talk about this, Cole. Same thing. He goes out and scores 24 points. Everybody's like, oh, yeah, there's the real Semi Ojeleye. Baloney. The guy gets lost still. Has he improved a little bit? He has. But guys on the bench, inconsistent, one-dimensional. Ojeleye, in and out of good games. Grant Williams, I never know what the heck he's going to do and do it well. The centers, I already went through. I mean, the bench is a disaster.
Yeah, the bench is terrible. I think that there's tell me if I'm wrong, but I think there's a ton of little pieces like Tristan Thompson, semi-usually, and Grant Williams that they need to form into a few like stud bench players that can shoot and or rebound or just have one main skill that they're known for, because we can't always put out players in the third and fourth quarter while Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown need a rest that we don't know what are going to do half the time. So we need to form skills around certain players.
I think you're spot on, Cole. And what you're talking about really is an identity for the bench. Like, is it great? Is it offensive spark? Is it defensive intensity? Is it, rebounding? What is it about the personality of the bench, which they don't have? Now, before we switch to the Brad Stevens piece of the pie, I do want to say one thing about Danny Ainge, that in doing some research before the show today, he has really done a good job with the draft, and I just want to quickly encapsulate it. 2017, he drafts Tatum and outsmarts the Sixers and gets the the draft pick for Fultz. He also drafts Ojale in the second round. And by the way, for a second-round pick, he's a pretty solid player, right? 2018, he takes Robert Williams at 27 for a late first-round pick. Robert Williams is a solid bench player, right? Bench player, one-dimensional, but worthy of a 27-round pick, right? But here's the thing that can get lost. In 2018, Cole, these three players went in the second round. Shake Milton, Mitchell Robinson,
Wow.
and Gary Trent Jr.
Wow.
So all three of those guys went in the second round. Now, I'm not going to start nitpicking on Ainge for not taking those guys over Robert Williams, because there's a lot of teams that missed on those three guys. But the point is, those were three guys that were available. 2019, he takes Romeo Langford and Grant Williams. Now, a lot of people are going to be hard on him, but I got to tell you, I researched that first round. After Langford and Grant Williams were picked, there was garbage in the rest of that first round. I mean, that was not a good draft from the teens and 20s. However, in the second round, you ready for this? Here's who went in the second round of that draft. Eric Pascal, Bol, one of my favorites, Talen Horton-Tucker, and Terrence Mann.
Okay, before you say anything else, Terrence Mann sucks. You just like him because everyone at home watching, when we were watching the Clippers in the playoffs last year, it said, you know how they had those little sayings, like the social justice sayings? It said, I'm a man, and then it had his last name. It said, man, I'm a man. It said, I'm a man, and he started making fun of it.
I just thought it was kind of a funny thing that I'm a man.
So he sucks. Talen Horton-Tucker is overrated. Eric Pascal has been nowhere to be found. And who else? Who else do you say?
The best big man ever, Bol.
I'd rather
next
have
to Taco Fall.
Yeah, exactly. The only difference between Taco Fall and Bol is that Taco Fall is a knockdown three-point shooter.
By the way, Manute Bol, rest in peace. We loved you from the University of Bridgeport. But to Cole's point, I generally agree with him, although I think Talen Horton-Tucker is going to be pretty solid. So the bottom line is, in 2019, you could pick on the Celtics for the Langford and Grant Williams picks, but there really wasn't much there, right? And then in 2020, now he steals Peyton Pritchard at 26, okay? And the Aaron Nesmith pick, the jury's out, although we've seen some progress lately. Although, just so everybody knows, here are the three players that he passed on with Nesmith. Sadiq Bey, who the Celtics made look like LeBron James the other night with a career-high 30 points. Cole Anthony, and Emmanuel Quickley, who's doing pretty well for the Knicks. Now, I still believe in Nesmith, and I think he's going to be a pretty solid player. But the point in me summarizing Ainge's drafts over the last 4 years is he's done a pretty good job. That is Ainge's strength as a GM. It always has been. He's a pretty good drafter. I mean, I was very upset years ago when he took Marcus Smart over Julius Randle, and I've said this for years. My brother Wayne will confirm. And now Julius Randle is an all-star stud on the Knicks, and he's really developed. But the bottom line is Ainge has done a good job. So with Ainge, to me, it's the lack of trades and lack of depth building on the bench that I think are the glaring weaknesses in how he's built this roster.
I don't see a huge problem with him taking Marcus Smart over, what's his name?
Julius Randle.
Thank you. Julius Randle. Because I think Marcus Smart, all-defensive team, he's such a great defender, and he's a great leader on the team, really provides a great energy for the bench and the starting lineup whenever he's there. So I really don't see a problem, and I think I'd actually rather have Marcus Smart than
Yeah,
George
except
Hill.
Cole, here's the thing about Marcus Smart. Marcus Smart's value on the Celtics, and this is a perfect segue to Brad Stevens. Marcus Smart's value on the Celtics is overrated because he's the only guy that brings fight and energy on a nightly basis. So because he's the energy guy and the intensity guy, then you can see since he's been out how much they've struggled. And that's kind of sad that he's the only guy on the Celtics that brings that. So that's where I don't know about the Marcus Smart, Julius Randle. Like, I really value the contributions Marcus Smart makes, but I also think he hurts the team offensively by taking too many shots at times. So we can agree to disagree on that, but I do think that Marcus Smart's overvalued on the Celtics because of their lack of quality energy guys. Now, with that said, one final thought before we go to Stevens. The fact that 2 roster spots on this team are taken up by Carson Edwards and Tremont Waters is a disgrace. Carson Edwards should be out of this league. He's not an NBA player. Yes, I know he had a couple of back-to-back decent games a few weeks ago, but he's not an NBA player. There's a lot of guys that can do what Carson Edwards can do. He's not a good defensive player. All he can do is shoot from the outside. Tremont Waters is like 5 feet tall. Like, I love his spark, I love his energy, but we can't be taking up roster spots with Carson Edwards and Tremont Waters, please. Now, Brad Stevens. So, I'm going to just say, Cole, and I'm going to turn it over to you. Here are my 3 biggest complaints with Brad Stevens, and we can tackle them one by one. I want to tell you what they are, and then let's tackle them one at a time. Number 1, his inconsistent lineups and rotations. Like I said, I never know who's playing when. There is no consistency to how he uses his bench. And again, for the apologists out there, you could say, well, he doesn't get consistent performances, so he's trying different things. But you've got to let people understand their roles and get in a rhythm. Okay, that's 1. 2, the use of Jeff Teague. And if I had a nickel for every time I saw Jeff Teague out there instead of Peyton Pritchard, I would be a millionaire because I don't know if Jeff Teague has nude pictures of Brad Stevens. I know Brad Stevens has a love affair with Jeff Teague because when Teague was signed, Brad Stevens couldn't stop singing his praises. But the play of Jeff Teague at all, never mind over Peyton Pritchard. And by the way, this is what desperate straits the Celtics have been in. Carson Edwards and Tremont Waters have gotten playing time over Jeff Teague. That tells you all you need to know. And third, Cole, the lack of an offensive game plan. They go to iso ball all the time. They do the Marcus Morris ball stop strategy, and they have Tatum and Jaylen Brown isolating, and everybody's just standing around in a slow motion offense. And then fourth is the energy level of the team on defense. But let's go one at a time. Cole, inconsistent lineups and rotations and use of Jeff Teague. What do you think?
I think that you couldn't be more right about that. Some games, Robert Williams is out there. He looks like he's making an impact. In some games, he doesn't even play him. Like, I think he needs to give these players more of a shot. Like, even he's playing Javonte Green more, which I really like because I think Javonte Green's pretty good. And I think he just needs to find more succinct rotations because they really don't make sense. Like, sometimes they'll have like 3 big men out there, and sometimes they'll have an all small lineup. Like, he needs to figure out the right lineup that makes the most impact versus each team.
Yeah, and I think Javonte Green, you bring him up. We hadn't talked about him, and I think Javonte Green at times shows spark, and he hustles around, and he makes big plays, and he's very athletic. But again, like, Javonte Green shouldn't be playing any big minutes. Like, as a guy, as a spot energy guy, fine. But that's an example of if you had a shooter off the bench, a knockdown shooter off the bench, besides Peyton Pritchard that could come in, you wouldn't even really play Javonte Green. So that's, again, an example of the lack of depth. Cole, offensive game plan. I mean, you're playing AAU ball. You know, you've had coaches. I mean, am I, like, I can handle it. Like, am I exaggerating? Like, when you watch the Celtics, does it look like they have a flow on offense? Does it look like they have a game plan? And by the way, Jason Tatum apparently is allergic to the first quarter. And this started in the playoffs last year with Toronto and Miami when he would never get off to a good start. He's done that this year too. The guy doesn't come out with the requisite energy and passion to start the game. So are they getting Jason Tatum enough involved in the offense? And do they look like they even have a game plan on offense?
No, they don't look like they really have a game plan, and they don't really look like they're even running any plays out there. Like, it just looks like they're running around passing the ball, looking for an open shot. And even if they do find an open shot, you don't want Daniel Tice taking a first. You don't want Daniel Tice taking the first shot in your rotation. You don't want him taking a shot early in the shot clock because he's not the best shooter you need to get the ball to. You want to work the ball around to your best shooters like Peyton Pritchard and Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown. And if maybe you can't get a shot to them and Daniel Tice or Semi Ojeleye or Grant Williams is wide open on the side or the top of the key, then let him take it. But we need to get the ball to our better shooters before we rely on the worst shooters to take our shots.
Well, and I think you make a good point, Cole. And I think part of the problem is, again, to the Celtics apologists who want to say Jason Tatum had COVID, he's still coming back from COVID. These problems existed before he had COVID. People keep wanting to put Jason Tatum in a league of elite superstar, and they want to compare him to Paul Pierce. Let me tell you something. He can't even hold Paul Pierce's jockstrap right now. Paul Pierce did things on the court, so many intangibles to help the Celtics win. He would lock down LeBron as much as you can lock down LeBron. He was the most clutch shooter. He had the most lethal step back where he'd create space for himself. Jason Tatum has 3 moves. He either does some pathetic fall away, or then he drives down the lane and Duncan Robinson halts his progress and he backs off from Duncan Robinson and then takes a fall away. There's so many times where Tatum is driving the lane and he has mismatches and he doesn't exploit the mismatches. Celtics fans and Jason Tatum and Brad Stevens talk about the guy doesn't get enough foul shots and get to the line like other superstars. Well, then drive the freaking lane. You're not getting to the line if you're doing fall-aways all the time. And look, I just like everybody else, I love Jason Tatum. I'm glad he's on the Celtics. I don't want to trade him. That's not my point. But the guy needs to take the ball to the hole. He needs to be more aggressive on offense and stop settling for fall-aways. And so I think part of the problem is I don't think Brad Stevens runs a lot of plays, period. Never mind for Jason Tatum. If you know Jason Tatum's a slow starter, get him in the offense early in the game so he gets into the game. It's enough of a trend now, Cole.
I could agree, and I think trends are such a big part of basketball, and I think that if you can't rely on a certain player to do something, then why do you have them? Like, I think you can obviously rely on Jason Tatum to shoot. He's not a bad defender. He can drive, but there's also players like Grant Williams, like we were talking about. Grant Williams, Daniel Tice, players like that. You don't really know what you can expect out of them. So you have to follow their trends. And if they don't have a certain trend upon their skill, I don't know what they can really do when they come out on the floor. And I don't really want to play them because there's really no safe time. Like, if I need a shot, I'd put out Peyton Pritchard. If I need some defense, I'd put out Marcus Smart. But I don't know in what situation I'd put out Daniel Tice because he really hasn't developed that reputation yet.
Yeah, I think that's perfectly stated. And this brings us to the final part of the show that we need to cover, which is my biggest gripe about Brad Stevens, and it supersedes everything. This team does not play with fight. This team does not play with heart and energy. I used to call Jeff Green the man without a heart, because when he used to play in the Celtics, and I know he had heart issues, so I don't mean to be mean, but when he used to play in the Celtics, the guy played with no passion or heart. When you live in the Northeast and you are a Boston sports fan, you identify with players that play with heart. That's why Red Sox fans love Dustin Pedroia. That's why they love guys like Trot Nixon. They want to see guys that get dirty and get their hands dirty. This Celtics team doesn't get their hands dirty. This Celtics team not only doesn't sustain energy from game to game, they don't even sustain it within a game. The Celtics haven't won back-to-back games for God knows how long. And don't talk to me about the roster. I don't want to hear about the roster. I want to talk about the coach who is supposed to create and inspire his players to at least, even if you have limitations in any other parts with your game, motivate them to play. I mean, for God's sakes, the other day, Aaron Nesmith dives on the floor to get a ball. Brian Scalabrine reacted like he had just done the greatest accomplishment in the history of basketball because a Celtic player dove on the floor. Now, that's not to take the effort away from Nesmith. It was a great play. But why is Scalabrine reacting like that? Because no one gets their hands dirty on this team. So to me, you can talk about the lack of bench. You can talk about Danny Ainge's lack of trades, but get the team to compete on a consistent level from game to game and within a game. And I'm going to tell you right now, and this brings us full circle, Cole, and I'm going to get your feedback on this. So we're back to where we started on the show today, the blame pie. Is it the GM? Is it the coach? Is the player? Well, Bill Parcells, former coach of the Patriots, on his way out, when he was mad at Kraft for meddling in his ability to run the team, he said, you want me to cook the dinner, but you won't let me buy the groceries, right? So, Brad Stevens, you don't have a great group of groceries. You have a good group of groceries, but not a great group. I acknowledge that. But I'm going to tell you right now, Quinn Snyder, Utah, he has Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert, 2 stars. And then he has some solid players around. Joe Ingles, very underrated player. Jordan Clarkson, great bench player, and others. Best record of the NBA, 24-5. Is Utah's roster that much better than the Celtics, who've lost 6-10 in their last 16 games? Okay. How about Denver? Denver, 2 good players, Jamal Murray, Nikola Jokic. Denver's got some solid role players around. Paul Millsap. Who's the young kid? Porter.
Michael Porter, before you say anything else, Michael Porter's not a role player. Michael Porter's an all-star.
Fine. Okay. Really solid young player, but he's young. He's still developing, okay? Then you go to Miami, Eric Spoelstra. You've got Jimmy Butler. You've got Bam Adebayo. And then you got some role players. Tyler Hero has not nearly been where he was last year. Still very good. Then you go to Toronto. Nick Nurse, probably the best coach in the NBA. I don't know how the heck he gets that team to consistently win because all they really have is Lowry and Siakam. Okay?
Van Vliet?
Oh, and Van Vliet. My bad. I forgot Van Vliet. So that's true. My bad. But we have Kemba Walker. The Celtics have Kemba Walker. So the Celtics' third player is certainly on par with all those other teams' third player. And then to really drive the point home, Cole, we want to talk about the impact of coaches versus the impact of players. You need to look no further than the Philadelphia 76ers. Doc Rivers comes into that team, and he has elevated the game significantly of Embiid, Tobias Harris, and Ben Simmons. Now, Brett Brown, I don't think, was a very good coach, but those guys are all of a sudden playing a lot better under Doc Rivers, okay? Let's look at the Knicks. You might be like, what the heck am I talking about the Knicks? The Knicks are 14-16. They're all of a sudden a 500 team almost. Well, guess what? Julius Randle's an all-star. He's got Alfred Payton making solid contributions. Who have the Knicks added? Obi Toppin, right? And then last but not least, Phoenix. It's a perfect ending to all the examples I gave. I know people, Chris Paul, they got Chris Paul. Yeah, guess what? Who went undefeated in the bubble without Chris Paul? They had DeAndre Ayton. Who else, Cole? They had DeAndre Ayton. They had Devin Booker.
They had Kelly Oubre. No, they didn't have Kelly Oubre. Kelly Oubre didn't play in the bubble.
Right. So they had 2 young players in Booker, but went undefeated in the bubble. You're telling me that Monty Williams hasn't elevated the performance of the Phoenix Suns? So please, Celtics fans, stop it. Stop it with the, we don't have enough talent. We don't have a bench. These other teams I've just mentioned, I've given you 6 examples of coaches that have elevated their team, unlike Brad Stevens. Cole, am I wrong?
You're not wrong at all.
So, Cole, when you look at the Utah example, let's just take that one because that's the most prolific example. They're 24-5. Is Utah even on paper, is Utah a better team than the Celtics?
Yes, I think they have a much deeper bench than the Celtics.
Okay. So if we say Donovan Mitchell and Tatum or Brown cancel out, and even if we give Brown an edge over Gobert.
Oh boy. I would trade Brown 1-for-1 for Gobert.
Oh, I wouldn't do that.
I don't know. Gobert's an amazing offensive player, and he's the best.
Well, he's not amazing. He's okay. He's a good defensive player.
He's the best defensive center in the league.
He's the Stifle Tower.
It's the Stifle Tower. I would all day trade Gobert for Brown.
Okay, but the bottom line is, I wouldn't do that. But the bottom line is, if you take the 2 best players away from each team and compare the rest, the next comparison is Kemba Walker versus what? Is Joe Ingles the Jazz?
Jordan Clarkson.
Okay, Jordan Clarkson. So I just don't think, yes, Utah's bench is better, but it's not like a markedly better team. So, Cole, final thoughts for me are I hold Brad Stevens responsible for a lack of offensive game plan, a lack of flow on offense, ISO ball, but the most is the lack of sustained energy and effort from game to game and within game. So when I look at the blame pie chart, I hold Danny Ainge a third responsible. I hold Brad Stevens a third responsible, and I actually hold the players about a third responsible. How does that feel for you? Do you agree, or would you break it down differently?
No, I totally agree with you, and I actually have a reason I think the Jazz are winning.
Okay.
I think it's the Mormon population. I think that's really a big contribution. I think the Mormon population really is influencing Donovan Mitchell and Rudy Gobert. I think it's really pushing them.
Well, because they can't do it, they really can't party a lot because the Mormon population to keep everybody really focused and calm and mellow.
Yep.
Okay.
Yep.
All right.
They're so focused.
That's an interesting spin.
Yeah.
All right. Well, that's it for this edition of The Right Call. And look, at the end of the day, we're going to learn a lot about a lot of teams in the NBA over the next 3 or 4 weeks, because the trade deadline is about a month away. A lot of big names on the market. Blake Griffin, Andre Drummond, and plenty of other names are going to swap places in the next 3 or 4 weeks. And we're going to learn a lot about Danny Ainge's ability to build a contender. And we're going to learn a lot about Brad Stevens' ability to maximize the talent on a contender moving forward. So for Cole Altman, I'm Mark Altman. Thank you for joining us for another edition of The Right Call.